Hello, everyone. My name is Elizabeth, and I am a CSPC Program Committee volunteer. We're about to start the panel titled Resource Extraction in Space, New Frontier in Innovation and Policy, organized by University of Saskatchewan. This year, CSPC provides simultaneous translation and closed caption for all panels in both French and English. Scan the QR code on the banner on the back of the room to download the app and access subtitles in your preferred languages. Please use your own devices and headphones. We do have the conference mobile app. Feel free to download the CSPC 2024 app, available in the App Store or Google Play. Please remember to post about your favorite events and panels at the conference using @SciencePolicy and hashtag CSPC 2024. Finally, please do not forget to fill out the evaluation survey for each session in this morning in the program app or by scanning QR code displayed on each session slide using the session number shown on the screen. Your feedback helps us improve the conference for next year. Enjoy the panel and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, not only for this announcement, but also your support over the last many months. And we got ready for this particular panel. It's very much appreciated. Thank you very much. And you have lots of patience in working with me. So thank you for that. Oh, good morning, everyone. It's a wonderful morning to see all of you here in this room for this particular panel about doing resource extraction in the space. My name is Baljit Singh. I'm a professor of veterinary medicine. I want you to note it. Veterinary medicine. No satellites, no mining, no minerals. So I'm totally quite far removed from what we are going to be discussing today. I'm currently Vice President Research at University of Saskatchewan as well. This particular panel came together during a chance encounter at a conference in Singapore in February this year when I met with Dr. Adam, do we see him on the screen? Janikowski. I met him there. I said, what do you do? He said he is interested in space mining. He has done some work in that area, done a PhD. I became very intrigued by that. I said, maybe it's an idea we need to take to Canadian Science Policy Conference to have some discussion there so that people from various disciplines who come to the policy conference could be exposed and contribute and see what Canada needs to be doing in this particular topic. So that led to the creation of this idea and finally the acceptance. And we are so delighted to have 4 panelists who have experience, expertise, and are really working at the front end of this whole endeavor. It is not sci-fi. It sounds like that. But as you will hear from the panelists, there's quite a bit of activity and momentum underway on this topic. Before going any further into it, I am going to request the panelists one by one to introduce themselves in a minute or so, and then we will go to the framing questions, and then we will get the discussion underway. I will invite all of you to get engaged very early on. If you have a question, I will create opportunities, not only at the end, but during the flow of the discussion to see what is really rising in your minds to ask a question to shape the discussion that we have in front of us. We are going to, do we have Dr. Janikowski with us? And also their slide, if you can put it up there, please.
Sorry, can you see and hear me?
We can hear you, Adam. We can see you as well.
Perfect.
Thank you very much. So, so let's begin with the introductions. I will go to the farthest end of the table. Dr. Hema Nadaraja, please.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor, for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Sorry. All right, thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here to speak alongside this panel on a very exciting, complex and rapidly evolving field of space resource extraction. My name is Hema, and I'm with the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. a Vancouver-based think tank dedicated to strengthening relations between Canada and Asia. At the foundation, I lead our space research program, focusing on the growing role of Asian actors and spacefaring nations and the implications for Canada. My own research stems from the intersection of international relations and international law, from my doctoral research in political science at UBC. And I'll be touching on global governance today of space mining and the challenges of reaching consensus.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Ms. Charlotte Hook.
Hi everyone, my name is Charlotte Hook. I am a PhD student in political science at the University of British Columbia, where my field of research is outer space politics and outer space governance. I also have worked with the Outer Space Institute for a couple of years now as a research assistant and junior fellow. The Outer Space Institute is a global network of experts who work on transdisciplinary research to find solutions to grand space challenges, space mining being one of them, but I have also done research on re-entry risks from the uncontrolled re-entries of space debris. I've done work on planetary defense, the coordination of activities on and around the moon. But space mining was one of the first projects I've been involved in, and so I'm really looking forward to the discussion today and talking with my fellow panelists about this really exciting frontier. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Cameron Dickinson.
Hi, my name is Cam Dickinson. I am an engineer at a company called MDA Space. I'm also an adjunct at the University of Toronto Institute for Aerospace Studies. MDA Space, you might have heard of before, but maybe known as SPAR Aerospace. So they're the ones that make the Canadarm1, Canadarm2, and soon to be Canadarm3. So they're on the back of the $5 bill for Canadarm2 if you're wanting to see some of the products that we provide. I've worked on a number of different missions over the years. I'm actually hired, I was originally hired as a planetary scientist. And how that started is I worked on a mission that went to Mars and actually detected clouds for the very first time. And most recently, about a year ago, there was a mission called OSIRIS-REx, which brought back a sample of an asteroid that we were a part of, that Canada was a part of, and now has a piece of sample of an asteroid that's about 4.3 billion years old. And that our scientists will be dissecting and looking at the history of it. I've worked on a number of different things since then, including looking at things. There's a lot of work that's being done right now on the lunar surface and how to organize a lunar base and how to land infrastructure on the lunar surface, as well as I'm now also the person that's leading the charge in terms of what we call in situ resource utilization, which is all the minerals and all the materials that are in our solar system. How can we utilize them for our exploration of space kind of beyond the bounds of Earth?
Thank you very much, Cam. Let's go to Dr. Adam Janikowski. He's joining us from Hong Kong.
Yes, I meant to be in person, and I have to apologize I have already, but apologize to my fellow panelists and to you, the audience. I very much wanted to join. I suffered an injury about a week ago and had some complications, so the doctor advised me I shouldn't be on a plane. I'll be fine, but I am here dialing in because I think this is a very, very important topic, particularly for Canada and Canadian policymakers. It's something we need to start putting on the radar. So by way of introduction, Adam Janikowski, I'm a Canadian living here in Hong Kong, primarily working in finance, but with a few hats. My doctorate was in space resources from the Colorado School of Mines. I was one of the first master's students and subsequently PhD students to graduate from that program. And my focus within my PhD was actually the privatization of space and the funding of the development of space resources. So looking at how do we move from a publicly funded sector to a privately funded sector, which is something I firmly believe Canada can be at the forefront of, which is why I think this is such an important panel. Amongst several of my hats, I just came from speaking in Riyadh on something very similar. I will be speaking here in Hong Kong next week around using private market mechanisms to help with debris mitigation. And I'm helping the Hong Kong government look at taking space and space resources and essentially space mining as one of their paths towards increased economic growth and job growth within the government here in Hong Kong. So I'm very excited to be speaking and hopefully influencing Canadians and Canadian policymakers as you look at this very important sector.
Thank you very much, Adam. Let's get the discussion underway. I think I'm going to invite you, Adam, to make some opening remarks on the nature, for example, the type of minerals we are looking at, some broad framing questions about the topic that we have in front of us. Then I will go to other members of the panel to pick on other interconnected areas that influence what we are going to be doing in the space. Over to you, please.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And
to
frame this,
take about 5 minutes, please. Yeah.
5 minutes. I've got the timer set. Thank you very much. And to frame this, we are not thinking about science fiction here. I call it the near medium term. It's not quite tomorrow, but it'll probably be within the 5 years that space will continue, and particularly the space resource utilization will really start to pick up. But what I need to really debunk the common thought, and what you as an audience need to think about, is what are those uses of space? Well, we're seeing it already in things like Elon Musk's Starlink. China is putting up a very similar system. We're seeing data, and data has been around a long time as a use of space. What we aren't seeing, we're hearing about sometimes, is asteroid capture. You would have seen some really fancy footage of people landing probes on asteroids, and all of the papers around the world are saying, oh, we're going to grab asteroids, we're going to bring back, we're going to mine them. That might happen one day. The odds of that happening are very slim. Not only will we collapse the economy, should you capture an asteroid made of platinum and bring it back, what will we do with all that platinum? What will we do with all the diamonds? There's actually very little economic case. Great imaginative case, very little economic case. So really, as we debunk this concept of mining for terrestrial, as we know it terrestrially, we need to think of what's of value in space and what's going to really be the near term. And from a non-mining, from a non-tangible resource, we're going to use space for power. Canada is a very, very strong oil and gas country, as we all know. We have great hydrogen. We have a lot of renewable resources as well as non-renewable resources. We're a leader, a global leader in power. What we will see is space is going to become a very important source of power for the world as we transition into a more sustainable future, as we move away from non-renewable resources. So power beaming is, outside of actually mining, it's going to be one of the first places we're able to use space resources effectively and commercially. But when we take it back into what are we going to mine? There's two things that really come into play. The first one is going to be water. Most people a decade ago or longer thought that the moon was very dry. Well, actually, we've discovered that the surface of the moon, what is commonly known as regolith, is actually quite icy, particularly in the permanently shadowed regions, the regions that never get sunlight. What that means is if we can successfully mine water on the moon, we can separate it, we can clean it, we can break it down then into its constituent parts of hydrogen and oxygen. And oxygen, by any other word, is rocket fuel, liquid oxygen when it's cold enough. There's a massive commercial opportunity for water, and we're starting to see many of the spacefaring nations start to try and take advantage of that. China, India, U.S. They're all trying to. The main reason we're going back to the moon right now is to capture that real estate. The second really important, and actually what I should mention, because this is a very Canadian crowd, many of you will understand oil and gas. There are already hubs set up, commercial hubs set up, where people will make a price for you on water. So the same as if you have Henry Hub or Station 2 in Alberta for natural gas, people are willing and have already made a price and offered a price for various hub water spots and water hubs. The second one that everybody needs to think about, and what the next kind of commercial resource we're going to be able to mine, and this one is one we may think about bringing back, is helium-3. And helium-3 is very important because it's very rare on Earth. It's the isotope of helium, but it's very, very abundant in the sun. And through that, solar wind implants have actually put this helium-3 onto the moon. It's getting more and more important in terms of aerospace. It can also be combined with heavy hydrogen, which then will help create nuclear fusion. So it's again another power. What we're looking for is sustainable power, and we're able to use space, and we're able to use the resources in space, basically to save the resources of Earth to create a more sustainable future. This is why people are really looking at this as a real opportunity. I'm almost up on my time there, but I will say that this is really exciting. You will see a lot of things about grabbing asteroids and bringing them back. There was 2 articles in the news I saw yesterday, interviews. We need to move our thinking past that, and we need to move our thinking into what's the most value. That's water and that's power. So maybe I'll stop there and pass it on.
Thank you very much, Adam. As we listen to Adam, the opportunities that exist out in the space, I mean, the immediate question is, do we have the right kind of technologies to get into the space, do the mining, and bring those resources back to Earth? So let's hear from Cam about the current state of technology, how he frames it, and what are the major grand challenges in front of us to really capture the opportunities that Adam has laid out in front of us. Cam, over to you, please. 5 minutes.
Thank you. Can we throw that slide up?
We have a slide here, and actually that will be very helpful. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That one.
Okay.
Okay, here's a question for the audience. There are so many zeros in there. What do you call this number? Millions, billions, trillions, what is it? If you have 20 zeros behind a number.
So the answer is 700 quintillion. So
Quintillion, there we go.
quintillion. From our point of view, the resources that are out in our solar system are effectively kind of infinite compared to what we have. It's just about access. So there's a lot of work that's going on right now about accessing different using technologies to access different points on the moon. The moon is a really hot area right now that's being very heavily studied and very heavily looked at in terms of, as Adam was talking about, how to get there, how to utilize the resources that are on the ground. So there's a lot of commercial entities that are now entering this, whereas before it was really the major space agencies from each nation state. So this is a real paradigm shift. If you saw, was it yesterday or the day before, SpaceX's Starship, that's the one that comes down and gets grabbed with the chopsticks, and it's a very exciting time. That vehicle allows literally for hundreds of tons of robots or vehicles or whatever we need to get up onto the lunar surface once it gets going. So this is a very game-changing sort of time that we're in right now, where we're about to gain a huge amount of access to the moon. When we get there, the technologies that we need, that sort of Adam was alluding to start to extract these are now starting to be developed. So the company that I work for, we develop robotic systems, including commercial robotic systems, that can go and literally do large portions of the work that's required to actually go and start to extract some of these things, as Adam mentioned, things like water and helium-3, as well as doing things like construction. So if we're looking at building a permanent habitable base on the lunar surface, there's a lot of problems that need to be solved, and to do that, we'll have to use materials that are present. We can start by bringing up vehicles and stuff to live in, but eventually we're going to have to use what's there. And as the slide says, not only are we kind of world leaders in robotics, so MDA, or its formerly named companies, have been in this, and Canada for that matter, has been in this business for over 40 years. So we have 40 years of experience of operating robots in space. We have a large mining sector that is very well versed in how to extract these different materials from different minerals and so forth. I'm sure Adam can talk about how Canada is well poised for things like finance. And lastly, Canada has made a lot of investments in AI recently, and we're somewhere, depending on which you look at, we're in the top 5 kind of globally for this. These are all the hallmarks of what's needed to start looking at the technologies for going to the moon and sort of and beyond to asteroids, and for doing extraction and for actually processing it. So from a technology standpoint, I think we're right at the forefront of being able to achieve these things. And in some cases, we can start achieving these now, depending on what areas we want to look at. The thing that we lack, unfortunately, right now is the policy that enables us to do this. So from a company standpoint, where we can't get insurance, and we can't unlock, there's a number of companies that are in Canada that are actually looking at resource extraction, and they're kind of waiting at the door to be able to start looking at that and looking at ways that they can go off and make investments and start to look at extraction of minerals across the board. So.
Thank you very much, Cam. Thinking about the policy, I think I'm very curious as to, are there some international policy frameworks that regulate activity in the space? It could be broadly shooting up satellites, or who owns which part of the space, or if we are going to go mining, who owns moon, as to what part of the moon China can go, or India can go, or states can go. Really, that also is a question which comes up quite often in the minds of regular folks who listen to space stories. So I'm going to invite Charlotte to speak to that, as to what do we have there and what do we need.
Yeah, so I'm going to give a brief overview of the policy landscape concerning space resource extraction and utilization. And though international space law has provided a great foundation for governing outer space activities, and Hema is going to speak more about that, the last treaty we have on space is from the 70s. And so there is a gap in international space law when it comes to 21st century space activities like space mining. And there's a lot of ambiguity around the legality of space mining, and there's geopolitical gridlock at the UN in formulating new space treaties. So states have taken advantage of this to push their own domestic space policies and pass their own international policy agreements in groups of like-minded states. So domestically, 5 states, the US, Luxembourg, Japan, the UAE, and Brazil, but Brazil's not on there, have each passed their own domestic laws on space mining that affirm that space resource extraction is permissible under international law. These laws exist because of the uncertainty in international law over the legality of space mining, and are intended to provide a level of protection, predictability, and certainty for commercial space companies, like Cam was saying, that doesn't exist in international law right now. And then on the international side, the biggest international policy agreement we have are the Artemis Accords, which were launched in 2020 by the US. These are a set of it's a non-binding political agreement. These are all voluntary commitments states have made, and they're not bound by what is in them. But these are meant to be principles to govern international cooperation in outer space in light of the rapid development of space technologies and activities, one of these being space mining. And the Artemis Accords asserts, as you know, the US domestic law has already said that space mining is permissible under international law. And as of this month, the Artemis Accords had 48 signatories. Denmark just signed on, and Canada was one of the first to sign on to these. I think there was originally 7 or 9 countries that signed on that were there at the start. And so Canada, we can infer, agrees very much with the US interpretation of things. Also, we have China and Russia, who have sort of set up their own alternative to the Artemis Accords. It's called the International Lunar Research Station, and this was launched in 2021. It's unclear what their exact provisions on space mining are, but, and we don't know how much it will conflict with the Artemis Accords or whether there will be consensus. This initiative, though, has only 13 partners on it instead of 48. So domestically, Canada has no policy on space mining, but as we are a signatory of the Artemis Accords, we can infer that a policy we would take on would be similar to the US and those other signatories. What Canada's domestic space policy will need for space mining is to be very clear to companies, the commercial companies, what their liabilities are and indemnification under international space law. Under international law, governments are responsible for their non-government actors. That's where liability finishes and ends. So anything MDA Space does, Canada is the one that will have to answer to it. So the government needs to be clear what position they're going to take on that. And this is needed, as I say, the current ambiguity in international law discourages commercial ventures because they're, insurance and predictability about what is going to go on, how they will interact with other companies. So yes, Canada, my point today is Canada should start working on their domestic space policy. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Over to Hema to further expand on the topic, please.
Yeah, thank you. So as my fellow panelists have already alluded to, we are at a pivotal moment in human history. Space mining is increasingly becoming the basis for strategic competition and collaboration. The global space economy is projected to expand to 3.7 trillion Canadian dollars by 2050, fueled partly by advances in space mining technologies and the increasing involvement of both nations and private enterprises. So major space players, US, China, India, are all vying for dominance, and private companies such as SpaceX and so on are also making significant advances. And we've already heard Canada has unparalleled expertise in both mining and robotics, and is uniquely poised to seize this opportunity, not only to contribute to the growing industry, but also to help shape a global governance or global framework to ensure that space is a domain of peaceful, equitable, and sustainable exploration. But there is complexity, as Charlotte has mentioned. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty laid the foundation for international space law. It's a product of its time. It leaves critical questions unanswered, particularly around the ownership of resources. Can a nation or company claim the water extracted from the moon or the metals mined from asteroids? So it doesn't quite answer this. So this cornerstone of international space law has 112 parties, including major spacefaring countries. It sets out very broad principles in outer space. Of relevance here is Article 2, which states that outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by claims of sovereignty. That means no territorial claims are permitted in space, and no one can acquire property rights to these celestial bodies. But it doesn't really say if space mining itself is permitted and how much can be mined, where it can be mined. So it's quite ambiguous on whether the derivative resources can be owned. And a common analogy is this. You can't claim sovereignty in international waters. The high seas, that is waters beyond national jurisdiction, is governed by the UN Convention on Law of the Sea. Now, if fishing in international waters is legal, what about mining asteroids and the moon for water ice or precious metals? The US maintains that the Outer Space Treaty's non-appropriation principle applies to space resources when they remain on celestial bodies. So it doesn't really extend to governmental or private ownership of resources once they've been extracted and they are no longer in their original location. And reflecting this, the US enacted its 2015 Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act, which formalizes this approach within domestic law. As already mentioned, we see domestic legislations in Luxembourg, Japan, and so on. But this approach still remains quite contentious. So some countries express concerns that the American interpretation disproportionately advantages countries and companies with the financial means to engage in space resource exploration and extraction. Now, this lack of clarity has led to debate within the UN. So there is now a legal subcommittee, a working group on space resource activities to assess the benefits of developing a framework that goes beyond the Outer Space Treaty, including additional international governance instruments. So it's also important to note that the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, when it was negotiated, US and Russia were the major spacefaring states. It set the core content for the subsequent 4 treaties that were negotiated within the UN. Between 1967 and 1984, during the Cold War, and against a backdrop of a very different set of political anxieties between the two major spacefaring states. China and India are parties to most of these agreements, but they were not major space players at the time. Neither was the role of non-state actors really taken into consideration in crafting these treaties. And these non-state actors are really at the forefront of space resource extraction technologies. Also important to note, the fifth treaty negotiated within the UN was the 1979 Moon Agreement. It attempted to establish an international framework, expanding on Article 2 of appropriation of space resources. Now, it calls for equitable sharing of benefits and the creation of a governing mechanism for resource use, which all sounds great. But there are only 18 parties to this Moon Agreement, notable exceptions being China, Russia, and the US, limiting its practical applicability. It should also be noted that India is only one of the 4 countries that have landed on the moon that has not signed this agreement, that has signed this agreement but not ratified it. Now, by contrast, the Artemis Accords seek to regulate state and commercial activities on the moon. These accords are non-binding, but they reinforce the Outer Space Treaty based on the US interpretation of resource extraction. So there's a tension between the Moon Agreement and the Artemis Accords in terms of national appropriation of resources. It's going to be interesting to see how it relates to some of Artemis partners. So Australia, for instance, has ratified the Moon Agreement. It is also a partner to the Artemis Accord. So how it's going to navigate its obligation between these two remains to be seen. Now, the Artemis Accords emphasize cooperation and transparency, but it does reflect, it is criticized to reflect national interest. And already mentioned, China and Russia are forging their own framework through the International Lunar Research Station, further illustrating the geopolitical tensions shaping this frontier. China has not signed the Artemis Accords. There is, so based on a congressional amendment, the Wolf Amendment that was passed in 2011, NASA is prohibited from working with its Chinese counterparts. So China is not part of these accords. Without any universally binding agreements, there is a risk of a bit of a Wild West scenario looming, a race for resources that could lead to conflict, environmental harm, and the marginalization of non-spacefaring states. But history does offer us some guidance. There are frameworks. So the Antarctic Treaty, which the Outer Space Treaty itself was based on, and the UN Convention on Law of the Sea demonstrate that we can forge agreements to govern shared domains for the benefit of all. Now, Canada's leadership is essential in this endeavor. We can draw on its expertise of upholding the traditions of innovation, multilateralism. It has the opportunity to chart a course of sustainable space governance. So it isn't just about policy, it's about ensuring that the choices that we are making today allow humanity to explore space responsibly, ethically, and inclusively. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it's interesting that on Earth, the mining is heavily regulated. In Canada, if you need a permit to dig a hole in the ground, it can go from today to 10 to 15 years. So there's a risk associated with all the permitting, and the billions of dollars are at stake. At the same time, it leads to quite a bit of social and political conflict because in many countries in the world, the land where minerals are, that's where most of the indigenous peoples live. So it's a very complex scenario as the need for the critical minerals and other metals continues to rise in the country. How do we keep on mining on this earth for the future, and how do we do that? Does space present an opportunity? If we are thinking about a few $1 billion to open a mine in Canada today for the next many years, what is the cost of exploring things in the space? What is the scope of the funding and the finance that we need? I think that's a very relevant question when we think about that, so that we can get away from the social conflict on this earth, but we can go to a place where there's no habitation today. However, that also is part of the risk, as Hema just laid out, that there's a Wild West out there, and some of the major players in the space now, that's India and China, are not signing on to the international agreement at this point. So how do we get to that place? But let me go to Adam for a moment to talk about what type of financing internationally is needed to get these types of projects off the ground, and where those fundings might be available in the private sector, and what roles does the government have to play in that. Adam, over to you, please, to comment on this.
Thank you very much. I might, well, first off, I have to say it's always a pleasure, but a difficulty being on a panel where everybody really agrees with each other. You're not going to see any drama here. So with everything that all of my co-panelists said, I thought it was very wonderful. It gave everybody listening to this panel a really broad understanding of what's going on. What I would say in answer to that question is the space economy, we hear numbers. We hear very, very large numbers. People say the first trillionaire is going to be made in space. McKinsey says the space economy will be 300 billion in 10 to 15 years. What we do know is, as of last year, the numbers are always, when you're talking billions, they're always kind of gray. But as of last year, there was about $79 billion invested into the space economy. That's not just aerospace. That's really the space economy with a view to developing commercial space, and a lot of that is space resources. With the further investments in SpaceX, et cetera, that number has probably shot up to 100 billion. The majority of which has been going into the States for several reasons. They've been a leader in space resources. They've been that's where they have the robust financial markets to support, and they have NASA. They have the big customer that is starting to fund commercial space. What's really interesting, and I'm going to bring it back to the fact we're all here talking about Canadian space policy. Some of my research was around what happens when these 5 countries that Charlotte referred to pass space resource legislation. And I took a very strong look and a very deep look at what those aerospace and those space economies were. And we found, based on the numbers that I just quoted you, let's call it $100 billion, as soon as the US and Japan passed their space resources legislation, they saw an uptick in $7 billion, $7.6 billion, according to my study. Immediately an investment into those 2 countries' space programs. So what we're talking about is investment. We're talking about jobs. The market abhors a vacuum. I think those of you who watch the capital markets, they really look at these. If you can't invest, if the return is unclear, if the legal framework is unclear, the investors are going to go elsewhere. So as these countries are passing space resources legislation, what I should add is we're about to see Saudi pass space resources legislation. We're about to see the UAE pass space resources legislation. Canada needs to be there as well, because we're going to see jobs, we're going to see investment, we're going to see a lot of very important things come out of our policymakers developing policy for this. So when we're talking about the scale, as I said, it's about $100 billion worth of investment. And obviously that's grown through effort. Now, there are other ways and other policies we should be thinking about, because obviously we all care about sustainability. We all care about equality. We wouldn't be Canadian if we don't. There are ways that we can bring some of these countries together and some of these Indigenous groups together, and that's through funding things. If you look at the Canadian Infrastructure Bank as an example, we as Canada, as a signatory to the Artemis Accords, can look at developing a very similar bank to fund space resources. And we could be a global leader for that. We could bring countries, Central African countries, Central American countries, Latin American countries, you name it. Through appropriate mechanisms where Canada can be a consensus builder, as we develop the policy, not just for space resources, we can be a market leader in actually using public policy and public market vehicles to start to develop this. And these are all the tools that we really have. So I'm happy to expand on this. This is a real focus of what my research has been. But what I would say is that the size of this market it doesn't seem very big now, $100 billion. But it's only going to get bigger, and other countries are seeing that. And we're we're in the perfect place with our capital markets. Maybe to emphasize that point, 8 years ago, Luxembourg, a very, very small GDP country, very tiny country, made the commitment to actually focus on the development of space resources. They said, we don't have resources ourselves. We are a banking community. We are going to commit to financing space resources. They had some wonderful leaders within the country who were able to push through this legislation. Since that time, they've seen a significant uptake in their GDP. I think now 2 to 3% of their GDP comes from the space sector, and a massive amount of companies, space-focused companies, have actually set up shop from globally. They've set up shop under the Luxembourg flag. So I think there's some real lessons. We're not going to be the first through the wall if Canada starts thinking about this. But we are early enough to really take advantage of this uptick that we will see in the size of the space resource economy. So I'll pause there
Thank
again
you.
and ask my fellow panelists if they have rebuttals or additions, or pass it back to you to moderate.
Thank you very much, Adam. Let me pause here for a moment. Any questions and comments that come into your mind so far after listening to our panelists? It's an opportunity to let's take a couple of those, please.
This question may be for Adam, but also for the rest.
Let's give you a mic there, please.
Thank you very much. This is a question maybe for Adam, but also for the rest of the panel, because Adam raised the possibility of other forms of resources, including power generation from space. I'm just wondering if we could fill in a little bit more how that works and to what extent any policy issues would overlap with what we've talked about with resource extraction, or whether it's just a totally different policy domain, what the considerations are in that sector.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll take it first and then happy to pass it on. I'm actually going to address that very specifically, but one other thing I didn't want to bring up earlier, but because we've opened it up, another really interesting opportunity for space is R&D. And what we're seeing is Canadian firms and many mining firms, many oil and gas firms, particularly mining, Rio Tinto, BHP Billiton, Caterpillar, they all have space-focused R&D teams looking at developing opportunities in space. But the commercial return on that is actually using their space R&D, using their developments that they've been doing in space for terrestrial mining. So that future is now. I think that's a really interesting point because there's more commercial applications than the brief 2 minutes that I had to talk your ear off. But coming specifically to power beaming, the way I envision that, and I think the way most people envision it, it's two separate thoughts. It's a sunshade, which will cool down the planet where we need it, which is a separate kind of power. It's also power beaming, very large very large collection arrays, which then beam down. Now, this sounds, again, science fiction, but it's actually quite, I call it near to medium term. Do we need a lot of policy around that? Absolutely. Do we have any policy around that right now? Not really anything I've seen that I could point to and say this is the gold standard, and really not anything I've seen to even point to say this is a reference. But there are a lot of people working on power beaming, for example. Hopefully that answers your question, but I'm happy to pass that off to the
Thank you very much, Adam.
Well.
Anybody else on the panel to comment on? But Cam?
Yeah, one of the other areas that we've looked at is on-orbit assembly. So being able to, so it's sort of close to the power question that you asked. So deploying our robotic assets to build bigger things in space. And right now that's an area as a commercial entity that's, again, it doesn't really have anything behind it. We can sell systems to other countries that have policy, but in terms of Canada, it's lacking right now as well.
And if I may, on that note, with power, we just saw the launch of a data center into space. So data centers are very hot investment opportunities here, but they also take up a fair bit of space, a fair bit of power, a fair bit of real estate, terrestrial real estate. Within space, there's unlimited power and the data can then just be sent down, and that technology is very well understood. So the opening of data centers in space and using that as the power source rather than a non-renewable or even a renewable resource here on Earth is something that is, again, the future is now. We're seeing that happen in real time.
Thinking about a project of this type, which is more like a grand challenge as to how do we continue to have the minerals critical and the otherwise the metals that we need to use for 9 billion people to give a better living standards across the globe. This will require quite a bit of coordination and policy and various sectors. In Canada, we are very aware of the fragmented nature of the innovation system that our country has, whether it is the connection between the universities and the private sector and the mobilization of the knowledge from the universities to private sector. So if we are going to pull something like this off in Canada and continue to have punching above our weight story in Canada, I want to invite Cam to speak a bit on it. What is the state or what would you like to see ideally for collaboration between the government and the universities and a company like MDA to drive the story of technological development in space resource mining? And where are we at this point, please?
Yeah, so I would say on the robotics side, we're very well positioned. Most of the universities have a Department of Engineering that has a robotics component to it. And we definitely participate in across different universities, and we collaborate with different universities on that. When it comes to specifically resource extraction, it's a little less clear. There are groups that look at that, universities like Western, University of Toronto a little bit, but there are not as much, there is certainly less sort of faculty at these different universities that are sort of dabbling in space resource extraction. A lot of that stems from funding, and it comes from right now our Canadian Space Agency. They don't. They're just entering into sort of space resource extraction, and the funding that they are able to put out is sort of limited, and therefore the researchers that draw from it are limited, and therefore there's less of them. So, but in terms of, the slide that we had up a minute ago, the other area is artificial intelligence, and that's an area of high active research in Canada. There's 3 federally funded centers, Montreal, Toronto, and Alberta, as well as specific universities like Waterloo, for example, just to name one, that are specifically going after artificial intelligence. And this is seen as sort of a quantum leap in terms of the technology to enable these things like resource extraction. The reason for that is to go off to these places that are very inhospitable to humans. You need to have something that is able to sort of take over some of the roles that humans would actually do. So when we go to the moon and we go to, Adam mentioned these things called permanently shadowed regions, humans cannot go into that. And so that's where the water is, or that's where the helium-3 is. We need to send a robot in to do that. And in order to enable that, we need to have the robot take over some of the roles that a human would do. And for that, things like artificial intelligence are very enabling. So, I mean, Canada's made a huge investment in AI and a huge investment in robotics. But as to the, so we do see that reflected in academic institutions, but maybe a bit less so on sort of resource extraction.
Sure. I mean, how will we bring these materials back from the moon to Earth?
Yeah, so Adam kind of alluded to this before, and some of them we don't want to bring back to Earth. A lot of the economy, we call this the cislunar economy. So if we're making rocket fuel, we don't have to bring it back to Earth. We have rocket fuel on Earth. But what we don't have is a steady supply that gets us between Earth and Moon, for example, or if we want to go off and explore planets like Mars, it's expensive. If you go through the math of how you get a rocket up into space, and for every kilogram, you need another kilogram of rock. If I want to put a kilogram of something in space, I need almost like a kilogram of fuel. And then to get that kilogram of fuel into space, I need another kilogram of fuel. And it just keeps building. And that's why these rockets are so humongous, is because most of the effort is spent getting fuel up into space. It sounds bizarre, but that's just the math of where we're at. So if we can create in space, either as Adam's alluded to, a gas station at the moon or in orbit around Earth or somewhere in between, then you can have spacecraft go up and they can refuel much, much cheaper. And we've now moved out of the domain of science fiction. And for some of these technologies, we are either able to do it or on the cusp of being able to do this.
Thinking about the policy alignment in an area like which is still very open-ended, we even conceptually have not thought through all the steps that we need to go. Are there examples from around the globe where a policy alignment has brought the major players together, major parts of funding together, to at least create a foundational story for building this mining in the space or the resource extraction in the space? And or if not, what type of policy frameworks will we need to mobilize all the sectors towards this grand challenge that we are looking at? Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Either of you too?
Okay. So there are international agreements, that can serve as models for space mining. The UN Convention on Law of the Sea, which was negotiated in 1982, governs the world's oceans and the seabeds, and that includes this region called the area, deep sea mining, which lies basically the area which lies beyond national jurisdiction. The UN Convention on Law of the Sea set up or established the International Seabed Authority, and that regulates deep seabed mining. There are currently negotiations taking place in terms of extraction. So the International Seabed Authority issues permits for exploration, and that could be seen as a potential model for space mining. You have the Antarctic Treaty System, which also formed the foundation of the Outer Space Treaty. And there are multiple protocols within the Antarctic Treaty System that also pertains to resource exploration. One is the Madrid Protocol, which basically bans resource exploitation in the Antarctic, but it is coming up for review in 2048, and that things could change. And you have multiple other agreements, conventional biological diversity, which doesn't seem like it pertains much to space, but it does have some mechanisms on access and benefit sharing of space resources, which we could also use as sort a form of a model.
Great. Charlotte, any comments?
I'll just add on quickly. So a funny thing about the Convention of the Law of the Sea is in the original negotiations, it called the resources that were on the deep seabed, the common heritage of mankind. And this is sort of a legal principle that these are shared resources. Everyone is entitled to them. There is no national appropriation. You can't own the profits that you get from this. And this was a really controversial principle and is the reason that the US did not sign the Law of the Sea at first. Even though it was a very comprehensive treaty, it did not just cover deep seabed mining. It covered, exclusive economic zones, the right of passage, was really meant to be the treaty. The US did not sign this, despite agreeing with the vast majority of the principles because of this one principle, because it was of the opinion that commercial deep seabed exploration and utilization was allowed, and it was not clear under the common heritage of mankind principle how this would occur. And no one really knows what the common heritage of mankind principle means. Does it mean that there are technology transfers for less economically advantaged countries to start deep seabed mining, or that the profits generated from deep seabed mining need to be shared amongst all countries? In the 80s, this was not something that countries wanted to start thinking about. So the US and a lot of countries did not sign the Law of the Sea until there was an amendment that established that commercial deep seabed mining would be allowed. This is a similar story in outer space. So the 1979 Moon Agreement, which negotiations were happening at the same time as the Law of the Sea, also called the resources on celestial bodies the common heritage of mankind. And that is also a big reason why many countries have not signed the Moon Agreement, is because the common heritage of mankind, though a nice principle in theory, just brings up more questions than answers about how do you actually adhere to the principles of the common heritage of mankind. So that's like a policy debate there. I'll also give like another sort of policy angle is that the principal forum for multilateral discussions on space is the UN Committee of UN Committee of the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, or UN COPIUS as we call it. This forum operates by consensus. Everyone has to agree to things that come out of it. And when you have major space players who have conflicting views about space mining that are not just tied to economic reasoning, but tied to ideology of what they think should happen to outer space, it is no surprise that we haven't been able to have a new space treaty or even a new sort of declaration on what space mining should look like or what shared principles would be. And this has led to fragmentation that now we have the Artemis Accords and the International Lunar Research Station, which are lining up to be conflicting approaches to space mining, which doesn't give commercial companies a lot of predictability and certainty over their futures and the investments they are looking to make, which are in the millions and billions of dollars. And this is why you also see then domestic space legislation passed to give those companies some sort of certainty over what they might be investing into. And in the Artemis Accords, one of the more controversial principles was this idea of safety zones. So if a mining company wants to go up to the moon, they probably want some certainty over what territory they're allowed to mine, how long they're allowed to be there, and what they want to do. And ideally, no one else is allowed into that territory to start mining as well, having that exclusive access. As the Outer Space Treaty has, this principle of no national appropriation, how do you reconcile those two things of you are not meant to own any sort of land, we can say, in outer space, but for commercial companies to start mining, they want some promise of this is the territory I get to mine. So the Artemis Accords try to reconcile this with this notion of safety zones, which is, a commercial company will have an application that says this is the part of the moon I want to mine, and no one else is allowed in, and this is for your safety. No interference, no getting in the way of things, no injury to your operations. But a lot of critics of the Artemis Accords say, well, given that these mining companies probably want to be on the moon for years, maybe even decades to make, the return on investment, that sort of looks like de facto appropriation if you are there for 10, 20 years and we don't even know how much of those resources you're going to mine. If you're going to mine everything, then who's going to go to that place afterwards? So to say
which is a big impetus for China to have gone to the dark side of the moon earlier this year. I think it's worth noting that it's not just these private companies, but it's the states that are getting into this safety zone race game, if you will.
Yeah, so just to wrap this up, it leads to a lot of maybe first come, first serve, that if you are the first there, you get to decide sort of the rules of the game. And so if you work in the space field, you'll hear a lot about a space race between China and the US to the moon of who's going to get there first and who's going to establish the rules of the game.
In the states where we have rule-based systems such as Canada, having domestic policy, national policy seems like what is the right thing to do, because to have the consensus among all the nations in the world to develop a space resource extraction policy does not seem to be happening anytime sooner. Countries like Luxembourg, because of their banking history, they have been quite a time the first movers to give financial stimulus to new areas from which then they make quite a bit of money. For example, artificial intelligence, Luxembourg-based financial houses were the first one to really start investing in that particular area. So in Canada, if we are going to move forward on this piece, we will need policy assurance for the companies who may go to a particular planetary body and begin to set up a mining operation, and then be assured that they will continue to occupy that space for a number of years to extract minerals or metals or whatever it is from that space. So that assurance is still not here. And some countries, I can imagine why China and India will not be signing on to those things, because they may want to be really occupying some spaces on these bodies and go from there. Let me pause here for a moment, go to the audience on your question and comments and any observation that you have from the discussion so far. Please take a mic there, please. And say your name and the where you are from.
Simarpreet Singh, Research Associate at Evidence for Democracy. By training, I'm a chemist, so this is very interesting to me. But pertaining to the discussion we just had regarding the last point, I'm curious regarding your opinion. Does UN need to form like a parliament to regulate space mining?
I am of the opinion that there should be some international body set up for space resource utilization. And actually, I have that opinion for space activities in general, including the launching of satellites. It's a global, domain, a shared resource. No country is entitled to either, the orbits that they put their satellites in or the places that they go to on the moon. And in the interest of fairness and equability, which is one of the grounding principles of international space law, that all countries, irregardless of economic or scientific status, are entitled to go to space and use space. I am of the opinion that there should be an international regulatory body that is not driven by one country's national interest. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If I could speak up there, that part of my research was looking at market participants, people who are members of UN COPUS or lawyers who participate in space, entrepreneurs, etc. And what a lot of them are saying at this point is they don't need the current existing mechanism. So 41% of the, call it 40 people I went out to, senior administrators of NASA, people here in Asia, 41% of them say the existing mechanisms are okay. 26%, so a quarter of those people that I quizzed or interviewed actually are looking for something like you suggested. So they would like some kind of multilateral organization. After that, just to square the circle, 19% of them think national governments should be doing it. And 15%, particularly entrepreneurs, think the market forces should be determining who governs these kind of activities. So I thought it was very, very interesting that most people, 40% of the people very, very active in this space, pardon the pun, think that the existing mechanisms are okay.
Thank you, Adam. Back to audience, please. Let's give you the mic and
Thanks for the great presentation and great discussion. I'm Abhishek Raj. I'm at the Critical Mineral Center of Excellence at Natural Resources Canada. Mm-hmm. So while we are still in the process of debating the overall policy and what should be the overall framework for agreement in terms of moving forward, I just want to see, like, in terms of next steps, in terms of understanding what other things do we need to go there? Like, are we having all the technology parts sorted out? Is that something that the national government can look into? What kind of R&D supports should the industry be looking forward from the government? So those are the questions. Like, while the overall overarching policy, that's definitely some way away from us. What could be the intermediate steps that we can start looking into in terms of developing a innovative, equitable space research and technology consortium with government and industries, or just like the entire ecosystem? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Abhishek. So some of the immediate steps that we can take, that's what you're asking, right? Thank you. Who would like to say? Cam?
So a lot of the technologies that are deployed for resource extraction, we are very familiar with. Canada is a world leader in mining technologies, and what happens right now when mines are being sought at or researched. There's a lot of satellite technology, for example, that's employed. And there's already groups both within Canada and globally that are looking at satellite technology, say in orbit around the moon or in asteroids, that are looking to understand sort of this. The first point is understanding what is there to potentially extract. Mm-hmm. So I would say from that point of view, the technology is very well understood and it's quite well developed. Mm-hmm. On the extraction side, this is where things start to, it's a little bit more piecemeal. So obviously I'm biased about robotics, but we're very well positioned for example, for performing robotic operations, as well as spacecraft operations at a lot of these areas. So on the lunar surface, there's a lot of money that's being invested. For example, Canada is investing about $1.2 billion into a lunar utility vehicle. This is a great step forward in terms of the investment to get different technologies around the surface of the moon. So that part, is I think we would, Canada is to be applauded for. Then the once you get there, then you have the whole extraction challenge. That is probably the domain right now that is probably the least developed. So just to go through the chain again, so we can find where the resources are using the technologies we have. We can land and get there between the different technologies of launch vehicle transfer as well as surface mobility. Once we get there, that is now the part where we start to extract the resources, where probably the development dollars would need to go into. And there's a lot of technical challenges in terms of operating in very, very cold conditions, for example. The moon is actually, when you start looking at it, is probably one of the most inhospitable places to operate. It is miserable. Mm-hmm. It is that regolith that Adam was talking about it's worse than sand, and it just grinds everything up. It's cold. It's dark for 2 weeks at a time in some places, or some places it never sees sunlight. There's a lot of things that are challenges. However, there's a lot of work that's being done on this to overcome these challenges, and they're not insurmountable. And there are companies, commercial entities even, that are coming up with solutions to these problems that that I think Canada can take a role in, and actually take a leadership role in terms of being on the forefront of where they're headed to next. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of capabilities in terms of engineering. We have a lot of capabilities in terms of we have world-class geologists and lunar geologists. We have a lot of history of mining, and as I'm sure you're aware through Natural Resources Canada, and a great history of how to, when we get those minerals, how to extract what we need. So putting that all together, I think Canada is extremely well positioned to even take a leadership role in some of these technology developments.
And capital markets and finance, don't forget the funding. Someone has to pay for all this, and Canada has a very strong capital markets in extraction.
Adam, actually, I was going to go there. Could you expand for a minute or two on the status of the private funding available in Canada for ventures which are high risk, which we are talking about here, but a huge opportunity which we are talking about here, and also an opportunity to develop technologies which might actually make be usable on this earth, because it's not a single-use technology that we are talking about. If you're developing robotics, they come handy on the ground. Yes, Canadian Space Agency is the one body. I have had a chance to work with them through University of Saskatchewan, with them to get $250 million sort of big project that they're working on putting a payload on NASA. So that agency does quite interesting, credible work, and is respected around the globe. So really, I want to go to private sector funding opportunities available, Adam, and how those could be mobilized, whether it is through our equity exchange or in some ways.
Sure. I honestly don't think the private sector funding is available right now, particularly out of Canada. But in general, we're not seeing a lot of private sector funding. We are seeing things like SpaceX are funded by the private sector as a company, but it's a B2G business. The government is still the primary source of customer, call it. And that's one of the interesting things that is starting to change. We're starting to see the business become B2B. I was just mentioned earlier, I was just speaking in Saudi. One of my co-speakers has developed basically U.S. geological service on the moon. He has all the data for what is on the moon. He is not selling to the government. He is selling to other companies. These are the businesses that we're going to start to see, and they're going to almost mushroom. To put it into context, as soon as China allowed private companies in space, the entrepreneurial spirit within that country, you immediately saw, within 2 years, you saw 200 private companies in space. We are starting to see very similar trends in the US. We're starting to see them in Luxembourg, the UAE, and Japan. These, coincidentally, are 4 of the countries that have already passed space resources legislation. So to get that money you're asking about, I mentioned it earlier, the market abhors a vacuum. The market abhors the ability to invest into something but not have any kind of understanding of what the risk is from a policy perspective. When we start to develop that policy perspective, we will start to see some of these dollars being funneled from where they are into space. Now, that being said, Cam has mentioned it several times. Canada is a leader in robotics, is a leader in AI, and there's a lot of government funding and private funding into both robotics and AI. That kind of investment, we can make more money. We can use that investment and multiply it if all of a sudden we had a space economy, if the government could develop a space economy. So, quite often you say chicken and egg, do we get the economy and then we regulate it? In this case, I think the regulation creates and the policy creates the economy. All the pieces are there except the certainty of policy, which is why I was so excited to have this panel be put together and to participate in this panel. We talked about the commons, and we talked about some of the larger bits. The Moon Treaty, sorry, not the Moon Treaty, but the OST, the Outer Space Treaty, those were developed in the 70s, and they were actually 60s and 70s. Those big treaties, they were developed with ambiguity because people didn't know what was going. And I don't think people at the time recognized the commercial opportunity, or they did recognize the commercial opportunity of space, but they couldn't regulate it, and they couldn't put policy into place that was global at the time. And now we're in this geopolitical deadlock. And in order to get this money that is already within the Canadian system and to a certain extent within the North American system, to get this invested in space, to multiply the investment and the value received from the investment, we really need to start to develop that policy so investors are comfortable moving in. And then the market will grow. The market will grow from being a B2G business to being a B2B business, which we're already seeing in some of these more policy developed economies.
Thank you very much, Adam. That's great. Back to the audience. Other questions, comments, please.
Hi, Bonsa Maruping. I'm from South Africa.
Could you take the mic close to your mouth? Yes.
I'm a big fan of space exploration and the fact that private sector has brought so much technology development. But I can't help wondering whether we are careful about not doing to celestial bodies what we've done to Earth. Mining by its very nature is very destructive to the environment. And I'm not sure that there's enough effort being put into making sure that we don't mess up the moon in the same way that we've messed up Earth. So yeah, just wondering what you guys think about it.
Thank you very much. The history of the humankind is we go into an open new space and we do some very interesting good or bad things to that particular space. I really want to invite any of the panelists to talk about this philosophical question. If we go to the moon or somewhere, are we going to do the same thing, leave unclosed oil wells and not clean out the debris or the chemical dumps from the mines? Please.
Yeah, I can take that. It's a really important question. And There are discussions taking place on the environmental impacts of what we are doing in space, and not just on mining. Orbital debris is a huge issue. The satellites that we're putting out there upon re-entry does have an impact on our atmosphere. So these are part of the ongoing discussions right now. Recently, Japan launched a wooden satellite made completely from magnolia wood, right? So there are advances in technology in ensuring there's there's sustainability, or at least there's environmental concerns are being covered in space. But in terms of mining, there are concerns that mining could alter celestial bodies, that it could contribute further to space debris. And of course, dust and particulate matter could interfere with lunar operations, but these are also part of the ongoing discussions. So it is not completely omitted, it is there, but that's why a framework is important, a global framework to ensure that we don't repeat our mistakes, our terrestrial mistakes at least.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I'm of the same opinion as Hema, and I agree with your point. It's a reservation I have about national space legislation and international policies like the Artemis Accords, which are for groups of like-minded states. This is why I'm of the opinion that there should be some international regulatory authority, not only to provide certainty for commercial companies, but to ensure global interests are thought about in the creation of a framework to govern all of this. As sort of an example of sort of like the terrible things that have happened on the moon in 2019, Israel launched a robotic lander that crashed onto the moon, and unbeknownst to them, a partner in the operation had put, they're called tardigrades, which are these like really small life forms that can survive hostile conditions. And so those life forms are on the moon now and were placed there by humans. And I still don't know what the reason was why they were put on that robotic lander in the first place. But it shows you just sort of the worries and like the reasonable worries that we can have about unfettered access to the moon and unregulated access to the moon. And though I understand the position that Canada needs to develop a domestic space legislation because of the gridlock we see in international forum, my concern is like with national interests in mind and sort of a pro-capitalist approach, will this, end up having severe environmental effects on the moon, which is, not only a, physical body, but is also an entity of cultural heritage. It has cultural significance to many peoples around, and damage to that entity, what can happen.
Thank you, Cam.
Sorry, just to add just a little bit. It is recognized, I guess, or it's starting to be recognized, the impacts. So though we're talking about the policy, and I agree that the policy will help to, if we put it in place correctly, it could help protect these things. But it's being recognized that some of the activities that are being sort of planned for the lunar surface would have a planetary impact. So even just the act of landing a rocket onto the surface, and it kicks up all the dirt, or what's called the regolith, across the surface, it can actually create a little bit of a haze across the whole body that takes maybe decades to return to normal. And if you keep doing that, you keep landing and taking off, and every time you do that, you put a little bit more dust into the atmosphere, eventually it gets to the point where your solar panels are not going to work very well. Mm-hmm. So it is, people are starting to look at these problems and recognize it. And I think that if there are safeguards in place, like the policy that we're discussing here, then from day one, when we start to really move towards a permanent human habitation on the lunar surface, they could have these things being protected so that it doesn't impact global or body-wide across the surface.
That's interesting, because
Exactly.
quite
Without
a few
policy-
of these, Adam, so quite a few of these planetary bodies have very low gravity compared to the Earth. So anything that gets lifted up is going to take a while to come down and settle. I think we are coming to an end. Adam, you are the last one. Take 1 minute, please. Then we will close.
I don't even need that last minute. I'd rather give it to the other panelists. I was just going to agree with Cam that without policy, we're going to have a lot of actors who are just going to act in their own best interests and not the best interests of humanity. There is a gridlock at the international level. That's not going to go away. I think we need, Canada is uniquely placed to take advantage of space. But I said this a couple of times, the future is now. Let's make sure that future is right, and we can at least regulate ourselves to make sure that future is right by putting in place the right policy. And in doing so, we will also economically benefit ourselves. So maybe I did take that minute. Thank you very much to my fellow panelists and moderator in the audience.
I really want to close by thanking the panelists for very engaging discussion on a topic which we might have thought of here and there when we see Elon Musk launching his spaceship and bringing it down and grabbing it by those chopsticks. Is quite exciting in a way what humanity can do to develop these technologies. But it also is an area where Canada really could leverage all the things it has done by bringing it together into a very cohesive piece, so that not only we can advance Canadian interest in the space, but also help humanity in finding a better way of managing, regulating, and using the space that we have there. Before I go to say thank you to the panel and a round of applause, I want to acknowledge the support that my colleagues at University of Saskatchewan have provided in putting this panel together. Sarah Daniels, AVP Government Relations, Daniel Helen on the government team, and Britt Tastard, who is the executive officer with me in the research office at University of Saskatchewan. Really, let's join in thanking the panel, please.